Test 1, 2, 3. Test 1, 2, 3. Test 1, 2, 3.
Can you hear me now? Good evening, Erev Tov. If people want to find a seat, we're going to get started. Just a quick reminder before we start to please put your phones on mute or turn them off or silent. So, welcome. I have it, yes. I will give it, I promise I will give it to you. So, for those who don't know me, I'm Rabbi Tamar McGill-Grimm. I am the acting senior rabbi at this congregation, Beth Jacob. And we're so pleased to have Rabbi Shai Held and Dr. Rav Ellen Prell here with us tonight in conversation with each other. I'll introduce them in just a moment. First, I just want to say that part of what has made this possible for us to be here with these two incredible people tonight is collaboration between synagogues here in the local area. And that's something that lifts my heart a lot, especially in times of division. So I just want to say, first of all, a thank you to Beth El Synagogue in St. Louis Park. They hosted Rabbi Shai Held as their scholar in residence this weekend, and were so gracious to collaborate with us and so that we could have him here tonight. And Mount Zion Temple is our co-sponsor for this evening, so thank you so much, Rabbi Spilker, for collaborating as you do so wonderfully all the time. Really, really wonderful to work together on things. I want to introduce our two speakers and then get right into it because they have wonderful Torah to share with us tonight. Rabbi Shai Held, philosopher, theologian, and Bible scholar, is president and dean at the Hadar Institute. He received the prestigious Covenant Award for Excellence in Jewish Education and has been named multiple times by Newsweek as one of the 50 most influential rabbis in America, and by the Jewish Daily Forward as one of the 50 most prominent Jews in the world. Rabbi Held is the author of Abraham Joshua Heschel, The Call of Transcendence, The Heart of Torah, and Judaism is About Love, and he is the host of Hadar's newest podcast, Answers Withheld. Dr. Rav Ellen Prell, an anthropologist. Oh, of the podcast, Answers Withheld. Yeah, that is cute.
I want to be remembered for that fun.
Dr. Evelyn Prell, an anthropologist, is Professor Emerita of American Studies at the University of Minnesota, where she also served on the faculties of the Center for Jewish Studies and Gender, Women and Sexuality Studies. Her research on American Jewish history and culture focuses on the dynamic ways that American Jews, both men and women, have negotiated acculturation, anti-Semitism, and the nation's economy to create collective and individual lives as much in conflict with one another as the larger society. Among her many scholarly and popular publications are Prayer and Community, the Chavurah in American Judaism, that was awarded the National Jewish Book Award, Fighting to Become Americans, Jews, Gender, and the Anxiety of Assimilation, and Women Remaking American Judaism. Her scholarship has been recognized by the Marshall Sklar Award of the Association for the Social Scientific Study of Jewry, and the Lee Max Friedman Award of the American Jewish Historical Society's Academic Council. In 2017, she curated the University of Minnesota exhibition, A Campus Divided, Progressives and Anti-Communists, Racism and Anti-Semitism at the University of Minnesota, 1930 to 1942. The exhibition, the largest in the history of the university, created a student movement that demanded the Board of Regents remove the names of leaders who supported racist and anti-Semitic policies and reckon with its history. The website of the exhibition has been visited by over 75,000 people from throughout the world. I'm delighted to welcome these two wonderful people to share their wisdom with us this evening.
Welcome. Thank you all for I have to hold it much closer, right? Is that better? Just a little? Now better? Okay. So I'm very happy to welcome all of you and to thank the synagogues involved in bringing Rabbi Held here, and very happy to have this opportunity for us to talk and to give you a chance to hear one of the really exciting and important Jewish thinkers in America today. So I began by asking Rabbi Held how I should refer to him, as Shai or Rabbi, and he asked me my preference, and my preference was to call him Rabbi Held because I like to honor rabbis, and then he told me he would have to call me Professor Prell. So I'm Revelin, he's Shai. We're gonna go for it. So I wanna open our conversation by asking what might seem an obvious question for a book entitled Judaism is About Love, but nevertheless is important, I think, for beginning our conversation. And so let me ask you, Shai, what do you mean by love, which you understand as preeminent to Judaism?
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Ravel, and thank you to the synagogues. Thank you to all of you for being here. Thank you for finding me more amusing than Modi. He didn't have that pun for his podcast. Seriously, thank you. It really is a privilege to be here. One of the first synagogues I ever visited as a scholar in residence before anyone could coherently call me a scholar was this very synagogue in the days when Morris Allen was doing his thing here. I think it was probably around 2002, maybe 2001. I don't even know. So it's really a privilege to be here. What do I mean by love? So I think it is helpful to make clear to people that when Jewish tradition speaks about love, it is not primarily talking about an emotion. It is talking about something with very clear emotional dimensions, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. But it is not talking about an emotion. It is talking about something more like an orientation, a posture, a stance I take in the world. If you like the language of philosophy, you can say love is a disposition to feel certain things and act in certain ways. Now, if you have a disposition to feel something and you never actually feel it, you either have already lost or will soon lose the disposition, right? You can't say I have a disposition to be grateful, but never actually feel the feeling of gratitude, right? So it has emotional manifestations, but it itself is not an emotion. Now, if this sounds obscure and philosophical, I want to assure you this is actually very concrete and I think very, very important, because you cannot build a spiritual life on a feeling, because feelings by definition come and go. Right? You can meditate for 45 seconds and you'll realize that you can't build a spiritual life on a feeling. Or at the risk of oversharing, I am from New York, at the risk of oversharing, if you've ever had the experience of waking up in the morning and feeling incredibly grateful for the gift of life, and 4 minutes later you're making breakfast for your kids who are bickering with each other, and you're thinking, I hate everyone I've ever met, right? Then you know that feelings come and go. So you can't build a spiritual life on a feeling. What you can build a spiritual life on, what you must build a spiritual life on, I think, is an orientation. So I think when Jewish sources talk about love, and certainly when I talk about love, I'm really talking about being oriented towards a particular way of being in the world. Now, I wish that in the book I had emphasized more just how actually dangerous I think it is when people talk about the spiritual life as based on an emotion or a feeling. Because if you tell people that the spiritual life depends on feelings of love, one of two things are likely to happen. Either they begin to lie to themselves and develop a huge shadow self. Some of you have probably you've been in some happy, clappy prayer setting, and you meet somebody, it's like, every Karl Bach minion has at least one person like this. Hey, brother, I love everyone I meet. And meanwhile, they are a simmering pot of rage, right? But they don't know it because they have internalized a narrative whereby they're supposed to feel love all the time. So they develop a huge shadow self. Or they say, I can't feel love all the time. That's ridiculous. I'm out. So when you talk about love as a disposition or an orientation, what I'm trying to do is, on the one hand, say something that I am aware is extremely daunting, orienting our lives around love, but also something that is at the same time accessible, because it allows people to feel what they're feeling, right? I give you one other example of this, which some people find more accessible. Many years ago, this was a day, I like to say, when my colleagues began to wonder why I draw a salary. I was preparing a shiur on Jewish approaches to gratitude. So I went to the library and I had ordered every self-help title that had been published about gratitude in the US in the last 25 years. And I go to this table with this wheelbarrow of books, and because I will always identify as a recovering academic, I can say, I didn't read the books, but I read at the books, right? I read the introductions, I read the conclusions, and like fully a third of these books said something that I found actually kind of insane. Right? They said something like, the goal is to feel grateful all the time. And forgive me for, my personality, I started thinking, okay, what if I'm driving home from my wife's funeral? What if my child was just diagnosed with cancer? What if I just came from the oncologist's office and they told me they're not sure I'm going to make it? What do you mean I'm supposed to feel grateful all the time? You mean well, I have no doubt, but that's an abusive thing to say to people, right? Sometimes what you feel totally reasonably is grief or indignation or heartbreak. What you could say, I think, is you're supposed to be oriented around gratitude. And that's a very different thing, because you can be oriented around gratitude and someone comes to you and says, what are you feeling right now? And you say, actually, I'm feeling like just disappointed and sad, right? There's no contradiction there. And that, I think, is actually quite liberating for people to be given the permission to take on the challenge of developing a disposition without the internal abuse mechanism of imagining they have to feel anything all the time.
So the follow-up I would like to ask, to build on that foundational understanding of love, is the book's arc follows the commandment. Okay, I'm sorry. The book's arc follows the commandment to love in widening circles of relationships. And later, we're going to talk about some of the challenges raised by who God commands us to love. But for now, tell us about how you understand these relationships built into the commandment to love family, neighbor, stranger, and God, and how they connect to one another.
Yeah, thank you. That's not only an important question, it's an important sort of net of questions. So let me start with this. There is a passage in the Talmud that has had a very deep influence on the way I think about Jewish ethics. The Talmud says, Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu ba bitrunya im habriot, which means something like, God doesn't make demands that human beings are incapable of. And let me put that in a more philosophical way. Jewish ethics works with the grain of nature rather than against it. That means that no Jewish philosopher ever is going to say, okay, human beings have certain natural loves. My goal is to completely override them. Right? That is not how Jewish ethics works, but rather, my goal is going to be to nurture, cultivate, and ultimately expand upon them. Right? That is like, I think, a very fundamental thing, meaning no Jewish ethicist ever says, you shouldn't love your family. Right? They say you should love your family, and also you should build from there to love in more expansive ways. Now, it's important maybe to understand that there are traditions. This is not universally accepted. In Christianity, for example, there's a whole strand of Lutheranism which insists that what it means to love my neighbor is to love every person in the world equally, which I have to be honest and say, it's not that only that I don't share that view, I don't even really know what that would mean. And in moral philosophy, you have utilitarians who often say something like this. In the most extreme version of this, someone many of you are probably familiar with, Peter Singer, the most extreme utilitarian in the world in this way, right? No person in the world makes any greater moral claim on me than any other, right? Here's what's problematic about that, in my view. Forgetting for a minute the issue that it cuts against human nature. It also eliminates from human life what it is that makes being human worthwhile in the first place. A world in which you tell me I'm not allowed to show preference for my own child is a world in which you have cut out the meaning of being a human being. What it means to be a human being is to have relationships. And what it means to have relationships, in part, is to show partiality towards people that I love, right? So the Singer argument is just very, very strange. And I would say, honestly, someone who functioned that way is more of a moral leper than a moral beacon, seems to me. Now, where it gets complicated is that those of us who argue for partiality in ethics, partiality in the sense of I'm partial towards you, not partiality versus wholeness, but like I'm partial to my family, say. The challenge is that all too often in human life, family first devolves into family only. Right? And the challenge that utilitarians and Lutherans and others lay before people like me is, okay, but you're basically just validating upper middle class people, preferring other upper middle class people. And that's a very important challenge. I think it's important to say most people do not think even remotely seriously enough about what our obligations are towards people who are beyond our more immediate circles. But I don't think the way to get there is to pretend that we're supposed to overcome our immediate circles. That seems to me to be to fundamentally surrender what it most essentially means to be human. There's a famous essay in moral philosophy in the 20th century, Bernard Williams, one of the great British moral philosophers of the 20th century, famously says, you know, if my wife and another woman were drowning in a pool, I do not find your question interesting. I simply do not, I don't find that question of any interest to me. Of course I'm going to save my wife first. Now, interestingly, by the way, Williams says, because I don't care about morality in that moment. I would actually argue because that's the moral thing to do. But we could kind of develop that. Now, there are Jewish versions of that, which is, I think Jewish ethics ideally works with a set of kind of intimate loves that ultimately expand outward to include community, to include ultimately the sojourner or stranger, the ger who lives among my community, although he or she or they are not a member of it, and then ultimately more expansively towards humanity as a whole. And then we have to struggle with what do we mean by saying loving human beings as a whole. But I think that the challenge is, again, moving from the inside to the outside, not starting with some illusion of total universality.
So before I ask the next question, I wish I had begun by saying that Shai and I are going to talk for about an hour, and then there'll be a half hour for questions. And cards will be passed out, and you will fill them in. Please write clearly, because they also put me in charge of reading the questions. So, okay. So building now on what was really foundational to the book, I found fascinating, as I told you when we spoke before, your discussion of the biblical view that contrasts sharply with the West, and that is that love, or any emotion from the biblical point of view, is not ever separated between emotion and action. There's nothing antithetical between them. And as you argue, and I want to invite you to talk about more and give some examples about this uniquely biblical view of integration and its impact on your understanding of love.
Yeah, thank you. You know, it's funny, I'm not totally sure that it's actually uniquely biblical. I think it is like robustly biblical, but let me try to answer this in the following way. I wanted to add to that question, to get to the other point, and thank you, I love that image of something being robustly biblical, that emotion leads to action, and action elicits emotion. And the question was, why is that unity particularly important in understanding the Torah's command to love? Sorry. Great. So that's again a whole pile of questions. I'll do my best to try and engage it in a helpful way. For me, it was a big moment of revelation when I was reading an essay by a historian of the emotions. First of all, it's a great gig if you can get it, right? Historian of the emotions who argued something that was like, I was like, whoa, is that really true? He basically says that until the Romantics, there was no notion of a purely internal emotion. And that we live in such a culture shaped by Romanticism that we take it as almost mother's milk, an emotion, that's an internal state. And he was basically arguing that was never really true in the history of the West, right? If you said to a philosopher in the 11th century, is love an emotion or is love a way of acting in the world? They would have said, well, yeah, right? It's exactly what it is. It's an integrated whole about who I am on the inside manifesting as what I am or how I am on the outside. I found that to be totally revelatory for thinking about Tanakh, for thinking about the Hebrew Bible, because it seems to me that there you really don't have a strong dichotomy between internal and external. If you ask the author of Vayikra, and I don't care whether that's a small a or a big A, that's not really my topic, right? If you ask the author of Vayikra, Leviticus, love your neighbor as yourself, is that about a feeling I'm supposed to have for other people or a way of treating them? I really strongly suspect that the answer to that question would have been yes, right? It's really both. And that's helpful because it also helps us understand something that Ravel and you alluded to a minute ago, which is it seems to me that Jewish ethics imagines that when my moral life is functioning healthily, how I feel is expressed in how I act, which in turn deepens how I feel. There is a kind of virtuous circle. I have often wondered, I can't tell whether this point is cute or deep, I've often wondered what it says about us as a culture, that everybody knows what a vicious cycle is, but no one knows what a virtuous cycle is, right? We use the term vicious cycle all the time, but a virtuous cycle is what Jewish ethics is interested in, right? Which is like, oh, I care about you, I express that care concretely, that in turn elicits deeper care for you, that in turn makes me care concretely for you in deeper ways, and so on in a growthful way that deepens our connection. I think that one of the reasons that's so important for Jewish ethics is that ultimately Jewish ethics and spirituality and theology are interested in addressing the entirety of a human being rather than breaking us up into parts all the time. This is not my topic, but I will also say that's why Jewish philosophers love the idea of the resurrection of the dead more than immortality. Because the resurrection of the dead was about a person. I recognize you, you're a human being. What is a disembodied soul anyway? Like, what is that, right? So I think this runs very, very deep, this notion that a person is meant to be addressed wholly. And so addressing a whole of a person means addressing the way I feel, the way I act, the way I think, the way I will, like how I make decisions when I feel torn between things, how I speak. It's all of a piece. That's the aspiration. I was remembering, I don't really remember why, but I was remembering, I think someone asked me a question about this at Bethel, if I'm not mistaken. Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, the 14th century Bible commentator, commenting on, I forget if it's Psalm 15 or Psalm 24, which are very similar. Mi yaleh behar Hashem, who will ascend the mountain of the Lord? Niki chapayim, someone who is clean of hand, uvar levav, and pure of heart, asher lo nasa lashav nafshi, who has not sworn falsely by God. And Radak points out there, just notice that that is a description of the unity of the hand, the heart, and the mouth, right? That's the aspiration, a kind of wholeness. So that's why it's so important. Now, if I could, I want to say one other thing, which is, and with apologies to those of you in Bethel who heard me talk about this morning, I think it's important to clarify and to underscore that the choices are not the ideal or failing. There are a lot of spaces in between. I can be kind to you concretely, even if actually what I'm feeling right now is distracted and self-involved. And it's good that I'm being kind to you, but it is not yet the ideal, right? So I think it's important to articulate the ideal and also pastorally to say to people, there are plenty of things we do that are good that are not the ideal. We only achieve the ideal if we're lucky at moments in our lifetime, right? No one ever really becomes no one but me, becomes a full embodiment of love and virtue, right? It's not how it goes. But there is always that aspiration that I hold out before myself and that we hold out for ourselves as individuals and as a community.
Thank you. So one of the things that Shai mentions in his book and is sort of intuitive probably to many of us is to say, wait, why didn't you call this justice is what Judaism is based on? And you explain the relationship between love and justice, but that's not the question. But just in case someone is thinking this and we haven't gotten to it, what I want to ask you about is your extremely interesting discussion of protest. Because early in the book, Shai makes the argument that protest is absolutely central to love, which is the foundation of Judaism. And he explains that Abraham and Moshe are critical models of the ways that loving God demands protest and calling out injustice and imagining a better world. And as an aside, this is only slightly wonky, you do mention that theology and ethics depend on one another. There is no ethics without a theology and a theology without ethics. They always enter into one another. So I want you to talk with us about how our obligation to protest a troubled world grows out of your theology and ethics.
Thank you. Actually, let me, in a funny way, let me back into an answer to that, because you said something that I love that I want to just stay with for 1 second about there's no theology without an ethics that grows out of it. And I want to just sort of give an example of what I mean when I say that, so it doesn't sound abstract, right? The Bible is preoccupied with the idea that God loves people who everyone else forgets about. Widows, orphans, who in a patriarchal society are literally the paradigms of vulnerability, right? In a patriarchal society, a widow and an orphan, a better translation for yatom would probably be fatherless rather than orphan. They are people who have lost an adult male to protect them economically, right? They become these paradigms for, right, people who are poor, and then the stranger is someone who is not part of the kin group and therefore doesn't have protections that come from family, and they're all vulnerable. And those are God's people. Rashi in Deuteronomy 16 actually says that. When you come to my house, you can bring your people, your wife, all right, this is a patriarchal text, right? Your wife, your daughter, your son, right? But you also have to bring my people, the widow, the orphan, the stranger. It's an astonishing comment, right? Those are God's people. Or as I like to say at Hadar sometimes, hey, guys, there are people in this neighborhood who are HaKadosh Baruch Hu's people. You know who they are? The homeless guy sleeping in his urine a block from here. If you believe in the Bible, that is making a radical ethical claim. We can argue about what that ethical claim is, and we can argue what the political expression of that ethical claim is, but it can't but have ethical consequences. If you say that God loves vulnerable people, that has ethical implications. It can't but have ethical implications. So that's sort of piece number one. Now, protest, the way that I came to writing about protest in this book is that I was writing about the centrality of gratitude for the grace of life. And I wanted to make clear that that is one of the places where Jewish spirituality believes that the spiritual life begins. And another place is with Abraham saying, this is what the world looks like, I will never accept that. And so on the one hand, there's this posture of gratitude, and on the other hand, at the same time, there's this posture of, wait a minute, no. And this amazing claim of the Midrash that Abraham discovers God precisely in this moment of saying, no, this can't be how the world is supposed to be. And what I came to understand in sort of thinking about this is that protest can be, and I really want to underscore with 50 million underlines, can be itself an expression of love. To care about the world enough to fight for it, to care about God enough to fight for God's world, and to care about vulnerable people enough to stand up when they are being exploited. What I did say, but I wish I had said more emphatically, is that protest has to be leavened by humor and a sense of irony about oneself, or else one becomes, quite frankly, insufferable, right? Right? There is one of the dangers of, you know this just probably from your own life, in moments when you've wanted to protest something, it is very hard to be a protester who also knows how to listen. It's very, very hard, right? And so I sort of wish I had, as opposed to just making that point, sat there for a while and talked about kind of like, what does a posture of humble protest looks like? A posture of protest that is accompanied by a sense of, oh, these people I'm protesting against, I might actually also have something to learn from them. I think we live in a time where people are staggeringly bad at this. Staggeringly bad at this. And then we have people who protest one injustice by embracing and erasing almost unspeakable injustices in the process of protesting injustice, right? So protest is, I think, a posture to be embraced carefully. I don't know how often that happens. That's what I worry about.
I wanted to ask you about, I wanted to invite you to talk to us about the very difficult issue of living in a post-October 7th world, and how your thinking about Judaism and love has changed or developed over this last year, particularly your discussion of what it means to love your neighbor and your enemies. How shall we understand, or to be honest, let's ask you how you understand that requirement toward people on the one hand who wish our people harm, but on the other, among Jews whose values and worldviews are so fundamentally different than ours, understanding they may feel the same as well. So this is another theological and ethical question for you to locate where you are at this moment.
Gosh, you don't throw any softballs, do you, Ravelin? Let me start by sharing an experience that I had that sort of landed very heavily with me. My editor for this book called me on October 11th, 2023, and said the following. He said, "I want to begin by reminding you how publishing works. Once a book has gone to press, nothing, and I do mean nothing, can ever be changed about the text of the book. There are no exceptions, period. That said, do I have to hold this book? Is there something that you need to add or say now?" I was so taken aback by the question because all I had ever heard was what he started with, and I never imagined the possibility of the latter, which I was very appreciative, obviously. And I said to him, "Give me 24 hours and I'll call you back. I have no idea." And I called him back the next day, and this is what I said to him. I said, "Listen, here's the thing. Right now, I have no idea how I feel. I'm trying to figure out how it can be possible that at one and the same time, I feel totally numb and like I might choke on my own anxiety. It doesn't even make sense to say that, and yet I feel both of those things at the same time. I don't even understand what I'm saying." I said, "So here's the thing. I can't imagine writing something now that I will not probably regret in 3 weeks, let alone something that my grandchildren will read in 25 years. So, with great appreciation, no, there's nothing I want to change." And then I had this moment in which I realized, and I said, "And besides, if there is one thing I am committed to, that I have always been committed to, it is that anti-Semites do not get to determine the content of Torah for me. I am not a Jew, have never been a Jew, whose Judaism has been defined by the war on anti-Semitism. The fact that I think Hamas is the most loathsome organization imaginable does not actually determine my vision of what I think Judaism thinks a good life looks like. So I'll pass." I don't know that I would want to defend that as the only plausible response in that moment, but it was very deeply where I was sitting, and I feel more strongly now than I did then about that. Now, are there things in the book that I would have said differently after a year after October 7th and after having spent the better part of 7 months on the road, having really intense conversations with a lot of really thoughtful people? There are. One is what I said a moment ago about protest, because I've been sort of appalled by the level of emotional and intellectual and political unsophistication of a lot of protest movements. But more deeply, you invited me to talk a little bit about love of enemies, so let me actually just do that very directly for a minute. The hardest chapter in this book for me to write by a lot was the chapter on whether there's a mitzvah to love your enemies, and that was really for 2 reasons. Number one is that I found that the range of Jewish sources that directly or indirectly addressed that question was so incredibly cacophonous that I had trouble turning it into a narrative of any kind. And more than that, and this is at the risk of sounding like a parody of myself, I think I literally wrote something like 20 or 25 different conclusions to that chapter. I would sit at the computer, I would write a conclusion, I would, it would take me hours and hours, I would write 2 paragraphs, I would say, okay, I can live with this. And then I'd come to my computer the next morning and be like, really? That's not what I think at all. And then I realized something that was, I think, either a cop-out or a resolution, maybe both. I actually sort of came to the conclusion that maybe I should just say that when some questions are so incredibly difficult and complex, religion is at its best when it gives us better language for the questions rather than pretending to offer us definitive solutions to every quandary we face. Now, that said, as a frame, here's what I think I learned about love of enemies. So, this is one of the many ways that there's a kind of truism in our culture about how Christianity says X and Judaism says Y. And I am, those of you who have studied with me know, deeply skeptical of any truism like that. First of all, most likely, with a big question like this, Christianity says X and Y, and so does Judaism, right? But leave that for a minute. I began to think about, okay, what do Christians mean when they say that there is a commandment to love your enemy? Right? Because almost any Christian ethicist would say, well, at the heart of Jesus' teaching is the mandate to love your enemies. But then, when it gets to the next paragraph of what does that require, there are a million different possibilities, and Christians debate very lovingly, of course, what that means. I take a political example. Does loving your enemies require me to be a pacifist, or is being a pacifist morally irresponsible? Right? Debate that goes on from Christianity basically since Augustine. So I did something kind of just as a way of my own learning. I started jotting down on a pad. Here are all the things I've seen Christian ethicists say that loving your enemy means. And I'm like making this list. And at a certain point, I stop and look at the list, and I notice, it's funny because almost everything on this list is either in Tanakh or the Talmud as well. Everything on this list, right? So take probably the most common Christian understanding of loving your enemies, non-retaliation. Jews who daven regularly pray 3 times a day for the capacity not to retaliate. V'lemekalelai nafshi tidom, we say in the Amidah, right? And the rabbis valorize those who are hane'elavim ve'inam olvim. In modern Hebrew, we would say nam ma'alivim. Those who are insulted but do not feel the need or do not act on the need to insult in return. The refusal of schadenfreude, right? The book of Proverbs condemns those who delight in the downfall of their enemies. And I started noticing this is really interesting, right? Like Christianity says love your enemies. Judaism says, no, we don't do that. Then you look at the list of what Christianity means by love your enemies, and you have all of it in the Talmud. That's really interesting. Now, I do think there are differences between the Jewish and Christian traditions on this point, and they are related, I think, Ravel, to where you were pointing us a little bit. One of the things that makes the discussion of loving enemies very complicated, I think, is that in English, maybe in other languages too, I really haven't thought this through carefully about other languages, but in English, we use the word enemy to mean a whole bunch of different people who are not really so related to each other. An enemy could be the guy I am rivalrous with at work. An enemy could mean, I was in business with my cousin. I didn't like the way she managed the books. I kind of think she might be a little bit of a crook, and we haven't really talked in a long time. And it can mean Vladimir Putin. It just is not clear to me that Jewish ethics would say, oh, well, my attitude towards 1, 2, and 3 are always the same. And what I came to actually understand, I think, is that when it comes to categories 1 and 2, I actually think the overwhelming thrust of rabbinic ethics is you have to love those enemies. You have to wish them well. You have to do for them when they are in crisis, right? It really pushes the envelope hard in those kinds of cases. Where I think Jewish ethics tends to be different from Christian ethics is, I think it's rare that you'll find a source that says, love Vladimir Putin. I had a really fascinating, one of the most interesting experiences I've ever had. A few months ago, I had the privilege of sitting through a conference of Christian theologians giving papers about my book and what they thought its implications were for Christianity. And one of the most amazing moments I had was when I said to Sarah Coakley, a very prominent Christian theologian, I said, Sarah, in your understanding of Christianity, ideally you would love Vladimir Putin and Saddam Hussein, right? She said, yeah. I don't know how, but yeah. And I would say, yeah, I think Jewish ethics actually simply thinks that's wrong. Now, I should say, it is important to remind ourselves that people we don't like are not Vladimir Putin. They're just people I don't like, or someone who has hurt me, right? So we're not off the hook by making that point. But in other words, I don't think Jewish ethics thinks I'm supposed to love Sinwar. Now, I will say one more thing. I'm sorry this is a long-winded answer, but you asked a very big question. I do think there are crucial pieces of Jewish ethics here. One is be careful about the way you speak, even and especially when you're talking about people you're at war with. I will give you an example here. And I want to say before I say this, that in an ideal world, what I'm about to say would not be perceived as political in any way. In any way. And it's only because we're living in very crazy times that someone might hear this as political. I want to say that from a Jewish ethical perspective, dehumanizing one's enemies is always unacceptable for two paradoxically different reasons. The first reason is that when I dehumanize my enemies, I license myself to become just like them, right? That's why the rabbis of the Talmud were so nervous about the biblical verses about Amalek. We hate Amalek because they murdered the innocent, therefore we have an obligation to murder their grandchildren. The sages of the Talmud read that and were like, excuse me, no, I have to neutralize this somehow. This is too blunt an instrument. And also, when you dehumanize your enemies, you paradoxically let them off the hook morally. No one condemns a lion for eating a goat, right? To say that Sinwar is, as Israeli government officials did in the first hours after October 7th, chayat adam, like an animal, is extraordinarily morally dangerous, not just because of what it might allow you to do. I'm not even talking about that. But because you actually, if he's a chaya, if he's an animal, then he's not in the same moral calculus as you, right? You cut the legs out from your own protest when you talk like that. Now, by the way, this is the point I would make about politics. Everybody get nervous now. In a healthy society, that argument would be made more by people on the right than on the left, because the more you think that a military response is crucial, the more you ought to check yourself to avoid dehumanization speech. You follow what I'm saying, right? I think this is a really important, this is why I think calling this comment political is just sort of bizarre. It's theological. It's like, do we believe in Tselem Elohim or don't we? Do we believe in the image of God or don't we? You can believe that someone is created in the image of God in Jewish ethics and believe you have to go to war with them. That's possible, right? But you can't say about someone they're no longer an image of God, because then you become a monster and you forgive them, neither of which you're entitled to do.
I have another big question, and I'm going to let you.
Of course you do.
I'm going to let you drink some water.
Yeah.
So that you can talk.
I'm gonna go take a nap. Yeah.
So you can talk. Well, I won't reframe it. It actually builds very closely, Shai, on what you were talking about, and it is, I think, more troubling because it is about a very deep polarization between Jews within, let's just to make it easier, within American Jewish life. And that question about this polarization that is so troubling as we talk about protest and as we talk about love is that part of what is so painful, let's just say for me, about that polarization is that values which I think of as fundamentally Jewish, and I don't mean just secular, liberal, post-Enlightenment, but really embedded in the Torah, about hunger, about human dignity, about how we treat the stranger, are in fact not agreed upon in a way, not to be naive, but I think most likely 10 years ago or before 2016 were more likely, I think, to be shared. And I want to pose the question, as I warned you I was going to do when we talked before, to get at your view of yourself as a descriptive theologian. You are interested, and did so beautifully in your book, of telling us what the Torah says. And you say wisely and carefully, look, I'm not telling you everybody who practices these things will automatically be better people. I'm not telling you what this impact might be. So Shai's very careful about that, where he puts his understanding of theology. But I'm not a theologian. I'm a social scientist. I'm interested in history. So I do want you to talk about what Jews do. And what I want to ask you is how you understand the stark polarization among Jews about what constitutes an understanding of reflecting God's requirements that we love and protest injustice. Help us think about how to make that move in our present moment. Because I do think the polarization, and not just since October 7th, but prior to that, in the face of anti-Semitism, in the face of why people vote in ways they could not have imagined a few years ago. Help us be our rabbi and our theologian, and tell us how you're thinking about that right now, this powerful issue, not just about politics by any means, but things so fundamental to what most of us think of as Jewish values that are now not viewed that way. Even finding a common vocabulary, even something to fight about, is getting hard, in which we can find common language.
Yeah, this is a really hard question. So let me start with the quote-unquote easy part, which is that I think anyone who has the chutzpah to try and interpret a religious tradition has to live with the yawning chasm between what they imagine a religion could be and what they think it is most often in the world. Any religious thinker who does not see themselves as at least partially critiquing the community to which they write is probably not worth taking seriously, because what they are doing is essentially sanctioning a status quo rather than trying to elicit something different and better. But they have to be writing for a community that they love rather than just condemn. Right? I think that's actually a very important thing to say. There have been figures in Jewish studies, for example, in university, who fancied themselves prophets, who basically hated American Jews. I could name names, but I won't. Right? But like, they hated American Jews. And you can't be writing as a Jewish theologian if you hate the Jewish people. Which is why I only write theology 2 days a week. No, I'm kidding. So I want to say this. In other words, there is the need to sort of live in the chasm between what you see and what you wish to see, and the refusal to succumb to a kind of self-righteous distancing from the people. To me, it's very important that my critiques of American Jewish life apply to myself, not just to other people. So that's like the framework in which I want to think about this. Now, I think the problem that you describe is really an extraordinary crisis, which I will describe it. You asked me about my own positioning here. I will say something that I'm not particularly proud of. It's merely a descriptor. In 2016, I spent a good part of that year writing textual-based op-eds about American politics. In 2024, I did that not at all. And that was because in 2024, I was living with a reality that I was trying to make sense of, which is no one is actually listening to anyone anyway. And so I don't have the illusion that some essay I write on CNN.com is going to like affect anyone. So then I asked myself the harder question, okay, so what are you going to do? And I think that my answer to this is it's essentially twofold. It's number one, it's to help the people I can and do talk to prepare themselves to take on the task of protecting the most vulnerable people in society. And it is about articulating a vision of Judaism that I hope and pray will eventually be embraced even by people who now have no time for it or me. I have come to think, and I say this with a sense of great sadness rather than grandiosity, that to be a religious thinker in this day and age is to write somewhat for the more distant future. I hate saying that, I have to say. I find that really kind of devastating, but that's sort of where I'm holding these days. And if we're just, if I, at the risk of sort of oversharing, I'll say as someone who lives with chronic illness and ever dissipating amounts of energy, my primary work in the world is not as an activist, it's as an articulator of a vision of Torah. And sometimes the visions of Torah we articulate take a long time to land. And part of what it means to have faith, I think, is to believe that, to know that you don't know which seeds you plant where will blossom into what. There is a reason that despite being beset by crushing fatigue, I've spent the last 7 months, first experience I ever had of waking up one day and thinking, literally, I don't know what day it is, I'm not sure what city this is, I need a few minutes. And actually being, okay, it's Thursday morning and I'm in Philadelphia right now. And I had this moment where I thought to myself, this is nuts. And I believe this is really important. Because I don't know who I'm going to teach a piece of Torah to who one day will protect an immigrant from being abused, or will protect a widow from being taken advantage of, or frankly, who will walk up to the guy at Kiddush no one ever talks to and say, hi, I'm so happy that you're here. It's not just about politics, right? It's about relationships. And I'm committed to doing what I think is my calling in the world, which is teaching Torah. And it makes me sad how much the Torah I feel called to teach feels countercultural in this moment, but that also makes it feel more urgent. And we're in a very bad place. We're in a very, very bad place. A lot of very awful things. I take perverse comfort. I've spent a lot of time in the last year reading evangelical creeds d'coeur about the state of evangelical Christianity in America. It's a lot of the same conversations that I think you and I would have. And I want to say one other thing too, which is you can't hate the people that you strongly disagree with. You can, but at the end of the day, that will move none of them and will only sully your own being. And so the question is, I know this can sound almost smarmily paternalistic, but can you pray for people to have a change of heart? Can you pray for healing in this society? Look, one of the things I think about all the time is that it is impossible, in my view, to understand the MAGA phenomenon in this country apart from the opioid and fentanyl crisis in this country. This country is so unhappy. The despair in this country is staggering. And I don't want to hate people who are despairing, even if out of despair they vote for things I find utterly repugnant. right? I don't want to be that person. And at times I am that person, but I don't want to be that person. And I find myself asking, okay, what can the people that I live with and care about do in some small way to help heal the misery that has overtaken this country? I don't know the answer to that, by the way. I just want to say, but like, that feels to me to be like a much more humane question than just, you know, sitting around hoping they get what they deserve given what they voted for, right? That's not helpful, in my view. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but that's where
Thank
I'm
you.
sitting with this all right now.
Thank you. So while we collect the questions that you are writing, I have my softball question.
Ooh, great.
But more to the point, we need to invite Shai back because I have about 6 more questions for him.
Keep going. Let's do it.
So, in an interview that you did with my colleague Abe Socher, I heard you describe yourself as a person who was very unlikely to have ended up engaging so deeply with Tanakh as a scholar and teacher, but you have followed that path. So I want you to tell us that story. I realize with some brevity because other people have many questions. But I also want you to share with us what the study of Torah, engaging with Parshiot, other paths to Torah, you believe can create for many of us who may not do this regularly.
Yeah, okay. Well, so what I meant when I said to Abe Socher that I was very unlikely to end up thinking about, let alone writing about Tanakh, is that my father was I find this term kind of funny, a world-renowned Semitic philologist, which means that 100 people had heard of him. But, you know, in the world of Semitic philology, the study of Semitic languages, my father was like a towering figure. You know, I grew up with around a person who was academically sort of almost mythologized even when I was a child. And then he up and died one day when I was 12 years old. And among the many complicated relationships I had to having grown up with a person who was sort of seen this way and then losing him is, although I was interested in Judaism, there was only one thing in Jewish studies that I never wanted anything to do with at all, which is anything related to Bible, ever. Ever. I mean, ever in any way. And then, you know, life has a very funny way of like doing things to you. I was sitting at a meeting of the sort of original faculty of Hadar. We were starting a yeshiva program, and we were talking about how it was kind of impossible to find anyone who could teach Tanakh in such a way that would incorporate modern biblical scholarship, but that would actually make it be about Torah. And we're talking about this, and then I literally find myself saying a sentence and then thinking to myself, what the hell was that? Right? Literally, I said in this meeting, give me 6 months and I'll give a course on Breshit. And like I said it, and then I was like, who? Like, literally, it was like the most bizarre moment. It was like one of these moments where your unconscious just kind of takes over. Thank God that's what my unconscious said, right? 6 months later, I started teaching a course on Breshit, and the course of my life as a teacher of Torah and as a writer was totally overthrown and overhauled because Tanakh has become, in some ways, even more my life than modern Jewish thought has become. And, you know, you can make interesting Freudian, you know, analyses of how I ended up studying the same text as my father with lenses that are antithetical to his, right? My father did not have a philosophical or theological bone in his body. And I don't spend my time analyzing Akkadian roots. Like, it's just, you know, it's very, very different. And yet, you know, some of my earliest memories are of being sort of awed by my father's complete and utter dedication to these texts. I mean, he literally would sit at a desk sometime for like 14 hours without getting up because he was trying to figure out what something meant. And that, I don't know, that image, lives very, very, very deep in my psyche. So, in some ways I'm doing something very different, and in some ways I'm doing something very similar. What ended up happening is that I think I was much more open to Tanakh as a 38-year-old than I had been as a 15-year-old or a 16-year-old. And I am continually blown away by how utterly unsettling the Hebrew Bible is. Every time I think I know what it says and what it's about, it takes me and flips me upside down. And I think as I've developed more of a willingness to listen to it and put down my assumptions about what it must say, it is kind of an electric experience. I mean, I'll give you an example, okay, that we just read in Shul, and that a couple weeks ago, that I talk about in the Heart of Torah, and then in this book in a more expanded way. Genesis 16 begins with a narrator who says that Abram and Sarai had an Egyptian maidservant, and then he stops and adds two words that are seemingly gratuitous. He says, Ushma Hagar, and her name was Hagar. Then you read a few verses about Abram and Sarai and how they treat Hagar, and strikingly, if you're paying attention, it's all about reading slowly, they never refer to her by name. They only refer to her as Shifchati or Shifchatech, my maidservant, your maidservant. Remember, the last thing the narrator said about her was Ushma Hagar. Hagar runs away from Sarai, who oppresses her. She runs into the desert. She is met by an angel, and the first word the angel says is Hagar. The narrator and God are co-conspirators in condemning Abraham and Sarai for, essentially, refusing to see Hagar as a human being, or as Tikva Freimer-Kensky famously put it, as a mere womb with legs. I see her as a mere womb with legs. Now, at the end of that story, Hagar becomes, and there's much more we could say about the story, and there are complexities and there are problems, all of that. The end of that story, Hagar becomes the only character in the entire Hebrew Bible to give God a name. And the name she gives God is Ata El Roi. You are the God who sees me. Or you could probably render the Hebrew as you are the God of vision. Same idea. Now, just sit with this for a second, right? Here's a story about an Egyptian slave of the proto-Israelites who oppress her, and she becomes a figure so seen by God that she and she alone in the entire Hebrew Bible names God. By the way, there's a reason why, of course, Hagar becomes a hero in womanist theology, black feminist theology, because the idea that the only character in the Bible who names God as a black woman is sort of head-spinning to African-American writers. Like, what? How did that happen? Right? That's not the Bible white people taught. Right? The one character is an African woman. She's an African slave, and she's the one who says, Ata El Roi. And I think about a text like that, and I find myself thinking, what does it really mean? This goes us all the way back to where we started. What does it mean to worship a God who sees those who others don't see? My deepest religious anxiety, if I were honest, is that I don't know whether I have ever, for one moment, actually worshiped the God who loves widows and orphans and sees the unseen. I want to, I think, but it would cost me a lot. That is really deep stuff. And it's done with such extraordinary literary artistry. And honestly, I love the fact that it doesn't just get up and say, hey, want to be a Jew? Go see the unseen. It tells you a story. It invites you to read it slowly. I always tell students in our Beit Midrash, no matter how slowly you read, the goal is to learn to slow down. Right? Remember when some of us were kids, there were those classified ads, learn to read 90 pages in 6 seconds, right? Jewish learning is the opposite. Learn to read 6 words in 90 days, right? Right? And like, what do I mean to do that? And to believe that those texts have the capacity to transform our hearts. That requires being open to the text. It requires a certain kind of teacher. It requires a certain kind of student. It's hard. It's hard. But like, these texts are, in the deepest sense of the word, searing. And the question is how open we are to that.
So we have a number of questions. Some of them are quite personal, and can you hear me? Some of them are personal, in the sense of wanting advice from you, as so often happens when rabbis speak. And so I'm hoping that we might have a little time afterwards that people might come up and talk to you in a way. We know that you're tired. I hear you're on the edge of laryngitis, but if I don't get to those kinds of questions, I hope you might maybe either drop the rabbi an email or maybe talk to him afterwards. So you thought my questions were hard? Fasten your seatbelt. So this is an interesting question. Where does loving God fit into the disposition for love? Where? I'll try again. Where does loving God fit into the disposition to love?
So, first of all, I really appreciate that question. I think it's actually a very deep question. And I would say that unless you are an extraordinarily rare soul, it is not possible to love God emotionally all the time. It is precisely the kind of thing that is a posture and an orientation, right? So it can bubble up at times. For me, that tends to happen in learning. For some of you, it probably happens in davening or singing or visiting someone who's sick. I mean, right? It can bubble up, but it is more of a disposition than a feeling. Like, I'm going to break big news to everyone. If you call me on a Thursday afternoon and say, what are the 3 things you're most feeling right now? I don't know that love of anyone is likely to be on that list, right? So I always like to say, well, if it's the afternoon, my first emotional thing is, I hate whoever invented email and thought it would be good, right? And like, right, and like, you know, and like, I'm kvetchy, and I'm feeling irritated, and why did I give my life to the Jews? Right? All this stuff, right? But if you then ask me, like, what are the orientations that guide your life? On a good day, I would say, well, I'm trying to learn to love God, trying to love my neighbor. There's no contradiction there. So I actually think love of God is a really good illustration of what it means for something to be a disposition. You don't walk through the world most of the time feeling madly in love with God. At least most people don't. Ideally, if you're blessed, you have moments when that does bubble up into consciousness. So I feel like it actually works well there. The harder question in a way is, wait a minute, what do we mean by loving God at all? And there, you know, I try to offer a kind of a range of answers in the book to that question, which I would divide, I don't think I do it there, into 2 categories: direct love of God and indirect love of God. Indirect love of God is, oh, God loves widows and orphans, I love God by loving them too. Or, you know, more generally, the closest thing I'll ever see to God in this world is the face of a human being. I love God by loving God's creations. But I also do think that there's a value for direct love of God expressed in things like prayer and Talmud Torah, right, the study of Torah. But the love part of that is very much a disposition rather than merely an emotion. Excuse me.
What do you make from the fact, this person wants to know, that Leviticus 19:18 and Leviticus 19:34 are separated by so many verses, love of fellows and love of stranger? They don't seem connected? Question mark.
That's a really interesting question because the problem with that, it's not a critique of the question. The problem that that question raises is that the order and structure of Leviticus 19 in general is somewhat confusing, right? Like, is there actually a coherence to the progression of the list, or is it meant to be a kind of like, here's a whole lot of things that being holy requires, and they require things in my posture towards God, they require things in my posture towards other people. I suspect that it's deliberate that those lists are not separated. Right? In other words, the idea that holiness requires both postures towards God and postures towards others, and ideally there's a kind of integration rather than, there's no list of, here are mitzvot ben adam lamakom, here are mitzvot ben adam lachavero, right? Interpersonal commandments, divine human commandments. Torah doesn't do that. Excuse me, I think that Leviticus 19:34, which is where we are mandated to love the ger, stranger, sojourner, immigrant, whatever translation you feel drawn to, is meant to startle the reader, meaning Leviticus 19:18, I think despite the fact that many very well-intentioned Jewish interpreters have tried to interpret that universalistically, it's very clear in context that Reah means fellow member of the covenant. Love your fellow member of the covenant. And I talk about this at very long length in this book. What does that mean about non-members of the covenant? I'm not going to do all that right now. But just when you're like, okay, well, that is a pretty demanding claim, the Torah then comes along and says, oh, also, those living among the members of the covenant, but not fully members of the covenant, love them too. And you're sort of like, wait a minute. Loving the members of my community is a lot. Now I got to love the people who are kind of marginally in my community. And the Torah says, yeah, and you especially ought to be sensitive to that because you had that experience. Deuteronomy, by the way, amplifies that in a really interesting way by saying, this goes to my point about Hagar, whose name is Hagar, right? Deuteronomy says, God loves the stranger, and you must love the stranger. In loving the stranger, you don't just actually love the stranger. In some sense, you participate in and become a vehicle for God's own love. That is very lofty stuff. I think what's happening, to go back to the question, is that you're meant to be startled by the expansion of the border, the pushing outward of the border, so it's not tightly held in the community, it begins to push out. Let me frame that in one other way. All over the ancient Near East, we have a preoccupation, at least in theory, with widows and orphans. Now, obviously, societies failed at this all the time, as all societies do. But it's a preoccupation all over the ancient Near East. The Bible is entirely unique in the ancient Near East in expanding the category of widow and orphan to include the stranger too. And that's really interesting, I think, because it is a move from being obligated to love my vulnerable to being obligated to love the vulnerable. The widow and the orphan are still my community. They are Reah. I don't always treat them that way, but they are Reah. They are my fellow covenant members. Stranger pushes that wall very hard.
Someone wants to have you underline. Tell us how you actualize loving your enemies.
How I actualize loving my enemies. Well, I don't find that hard because I'm a saint. I don't know if this is what the questioner means, but I'll tell you something that I have started thinking about a lot in the last couple of years. A text that I learned in the process of writing the book. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avot famously says, "Hevei dan et kol ha'adam l'chav zchut," right? Which clearly means judge every person favorably. But there is a tradition among certain modern commentators to sort of deliberately misread that and read, have done it kol ha'adam l'chav zchut, to mean judge the entirety of the person favorably. And one particular Haredi thinker who I find really interesting, someone named Rabbi Natan Gestetner, was a posek, halachic decision maker in Jerusalem, Bnei Brak, I forget. He says this really gorgeous thing. He says, you know, when someone really hurts you, it is very tempting to see them as defined beginning to end by the way they hurt you. And when the Mishnah says judge the entirety of the person favorably, it is inviting you to consider the story of their life and to ask, what might they have experienced that led them to treat me in this way? I find that to be a very powerful practice. There's a Christian philosopher named Robert Roberts. Don't ask me why his parents did that to him, but he is a truly fascinating moral philosopher, and he speaks in one of his essays about how when people hurt us, we tend to turn them into monsters in our imagination. And what I understand what Rav Gestetner is suggesting is demonsterify the people who hurt you. Right? The person who hurt me is not a monster, they're a person who hurt me. And them being my enemy is not the entirety of their identity. They're also a person with a spouse and kids and a home and fears and anxieties. Now, I don't know whether the question is supposed to be about how I relate to Sinwar. I don't like him. But if it's about sort of the work of enemies, people that I really don't like, that's very hard, painstaking, over and over again spiritual work. By the way, more fundamentally, something that I think about, which I'm almost embarrassed to admit this, is that sometimes when I encounter someone who drives me crazy, right? I force myself to stop and say, according to the theology that you uphold, God loves this human being infinitely more than you love your own children. So take a deep breath. I'll also say something else. Now, this is very much in the realm of oversharing. Have you ever been, don't raise your hand because I don't want to embarrass you. Have you ever been in a supermarket and someone walks by you? You've never met them, you've never spoken to them, but suddenly you find yourself with an entire narrative about who they are and why you really dislike them? I find that to be a really interesting opportunity to actually stop and ask myself, what am I doing and why am I doing it? Because that moment, it's important to remind myself, has absolutely nothing to do with them and everything to do with me. Right? So sometimes when I've never met you, but I dislike you a lot, it might not be about you. And it might be an opportunity for me to grow in terms of understanding the not wonderful parts of myself. All of that feel to me to be the ways that, one could try to operationalize just loving other people. The guy who I haven't met in the story is obviously not my enemy unless I'm delusional, right? But I'm trying to create a kind of spectrum here of different kinds of people I might hold negative attitudes to, and changing the way that I view them. Which leads me to want to say one other thing that became really important to me as I kind of dawned on me only as I was sort of almost done working on this book, which is that we tend to think of love as a way of feeling or a way of acting. But I think in Jewish ethics, love is also very much a way of seeing. Part of what it means to love your neighbor is to train your eyes to see in particular ways, and that is very hard work. It's very countercultural. We don't talk this way. We don't think this way. But like, actually, the project of seeing. What do I see when I see another human being? What do I see when I see another human being who looks different from me? What do I see when I see another human being whose accent frightens me? All these kinds of questions, like how do I look? Those are they feel like very basic questions to me, and I really would underscore they take very painstaking work, because it's not the kind of thing where you're like, oh, I noticed that I do that, I'm going to stop. It doesn't actually happen that way, I don't think, right? It's like, oh, I'm going to need to work on this constantly if I want to work on this.
So, Shai, our final question
Is an easy one.
It's a wonderful question that any person who's written a book should have a chance to answer. Has writing your book about Judaism and love changed the way you see the world?
Oh my God, yes. I mean, well, so first I should say, this book, I spent on and off probably 6.5 years writing it, and yet some of the chapters in this book grow out of shiurim that I've been playing with people for 25 years. And in some cases, even longer than that. One of the biggest challenges of writing a book about love is that you regularly ask yourself, or at least I did, who are you to be writing this book? And that means that actually I felt like the cost of admission, the price of admission for writing this book, was I had to be committed to growing in my own capacity for love in a deeper and more insistent way than I ever had before. And I certainly don't think I'm some paradigm of any of it, but it was a constant. On a good day, it was an inspiration, and on a bad day, it was a goad. Like, how do you conduct yourself? How do you look at people? How do you talk to people? I think I might have said to my wife at some point, I'm going to have to really be a mensch in the world if I'm going to publish this book. I don't know if I'm up to it, And there are moments where I for sure fail. But it sort of has become a little bit of a lodestar for me in my own life. And I hope can also offer inspiration, for my children and grandchildren, for my students and grandstudents. That's what I hope for most sort of deeply in the world, is that, someone reads, experiences what I'm trying to do in this book and feels challenged, inspired, summoned, commanded to make this world somehow a place of greater love and chesed. Kain Yehi Ratzon, I would say, would that be true even in the smallest ways?
So before I invite you to join me in thanking Shai for this just wonderful presentation, I want to say I was so pleased to see that there are copies of his books in the lobby. So after this and a previous conversation with him and having read the book, this was only a fraction of what that book is actually about. There is so much more and so much richness, both intellectually and in the inspiring way that Shai has talked about what it has called him to become. So I really want to urge and invite you, in whatever form you read, hardback, digital, which is how I read it, or whatever, to really read and engage with this book, because it is really remarkable. So please join me in thanking Shai for this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim.
bet.